Is so interesting. I know we have to let you go, but I want to keep you for 2 more minutes if I can ask you just 2 more questions, which I think are going to be very helpful to us. In this urban strategy or the new strategy that we're putting out, there are 2 or 3 charges that are leveled at us, and I want you to tackle them. One is people level this charge at us that this strategy, because we are focusing on the urban areas, is not poor friendly. The second charge is that we're ignoring the rural areas. You, in a sense, talked about it, but there is an underlying narrative here where everybody seems to want to free society. People want to say, leave the people in the villages. For example, we had a flood last year, an earthquake 5 years ago, and the narrative is, let's rebuild those villages. Much like Katrina, you mentioned Glazer. Glazer talks about Katrina. Should we encourage mobility into cities? Is the urban dimension the way forward for poverty eradication? And then I might, well, will you answer that? Then I'll ask you another question if possible.
Okay. First, I think it's a mistake to say something is urban focused and not rural friendly. And I can just give you by way of example. Many years ago, I was part of a group between the U.S. and Korea. And the big debate there was Seoul has gotten too big. Seoul is consuming all the resources. How do we reallocate, redistribute the resources to the rest of Korea? And I just said something very simple. So simple it almost sounds silly. I said, look at Shanghai, look at Singapore, look at Hong Kong, look at all the cities around you. If you weaken Seoul, you're done. It doesn't matter what you try to do to the littler cities. If you weaken your big city, if you don't have the strongest city in a spiky world, if your cities aren't able to compete with all of those I mentioned, and Toronto, and all, you can't do anything. So an urban strategy will make the rural stronger. But because without it, without a strong spike of economic activity, you can't compete. The second one is something I challenge my students with. You know, I have very many social justice-oriented students. They're wonderful. They come to Toronto. They want to help poor people. And they said exactly this: Professor Florida, you're a terrible person. You want to encourage the rural dweller to migrate and to leave his home and to leave his people. So I said, go back and read what happens in Africa or in developing economies in some of those rural villages. And I said, I challenge you. I think when you come back, take this basic principle. When you read all of that, should we make migration a human right? Should the ability to migrate and improve yourself and your family be a human right? Every one of them came back the next time after looking at what happens in these villages and saying, you know, you were right. It should be a human right. People should have the ability to migrate. The ability for a country to urbanize. I would say this. We believe that countries industrialize by investing in industry. We believe that countries industrialize by doing more trade. We believe that countries industrialize by having a deeper division of labor. Countries industrialize by urbanizing. There's countries developed by urbanizing. There's no more basic precondition of growth and development than urbanization, because urbanization creates the pockets where people can do more, become more productive, innovate. So any way you could tilt the balance, and I'm not trying tilt the balance from rural to urban. Any way you can encourage that flow of people is going to improve their lives and is going to improve and make that adjustment simpler and easier, more fluid, is going to improve the condition of their lives, of the community's life, and of the country's economic progress.
Richard, one final point. People also level the charge at us that you have forgotten the sine qua non of development, which is export-led growth. All this can wait until we have had export-led growth, until you exported the last T-shirt. So I'd like you to comment on that.
Has export-led growth worked? Do we have shining examples of export-led growth? Is export-led growth sustainable? Is it a way to develop a country? Don't get me wrong, it was a time-bound strategy. In an industrial era where branch plants could be broken off from a Westinghouse or a Mitsubishi or a Ford or a Nissan or a textile company and brought to a southern location or brought offshore to come to an area in Pakistan, yeah. But it seems to me that in order for a country to really develop, it has to develop its own resources. Its own resources, partly natural, partly God-given, but the most important resource a country has is its people. It has to develop them, and I think the other part that's happened is because of all the things that you've talked about today, many of the great human resources, human creativity that come out of a country like Pakistan not only leave the farm, they leave the country. They go to London, they go to New York, they go to Washington, D.C., they go to Silicon Valley, they go to here, there, Toronto. It seems to me that half the battle has to be making sure the people who would jump the country make a shorter jump. That if you have vibrant, exciting cities that can mobilize that talent, and instead of jumping to London or New York, they'll jump to a great city in Pakistan, or when they've accomplished something. And that's why I think the Saxenian is so important, Natalie Saxenian. The notion of brain circulation. The notion that what happened in countries like Taiwan was not a first wave of innovators moved to Silicon Valley, but they had such a tie back to their country, they wanted to give back, and then they began to start enterprises back home. So taking that whole diaspora, if you will, that global diaspora, focusing on it and saying we have the kind of cities and exciting, not because they're great fun cities, not because they're party cities, because they're the place you can come and mobilize resources and build your business and build your dream. That strategy of focusing on resource development, of deepening resource development, of building human capital and human creativity, that seems to me a much more appropriate strategy for development in our time than the older, and I think controversial, perhaps somewhat failed strategy of export-led development. I think that's where you're headed, and I applaud your efforts, and I'd like to be able to help. One last thing, Nadine. If anyone didn't get to ask a question, one, you can send me a question on Twitter. I'm Richard Florida, and that's how Umar, your son, and I communicate all the time. But if you don't use Twitter, my email is florida@creativeclass.com. Florida@creativeclass.com. And feel free, anyone who's participating, yourself, members of the committee, others who are part of the conversation, feel free to send me a note, and let's continue this conversation.
Richard, before you go, you have to give us a little bit of insight into the Great Reset and the institutional sclerosis that you talked about, because we seem to have that here too, but this time we are in good company because the whole world seems to have institutional sclerosis after the great crisis, and you're talking about a reset. How is the reset going to happen?
Well, you know, I've looked at this for a long time now, and I think in every crisis what happens is most countries and most communities are trapped by institutional sclerosis. That's why it takes a generation. The institutions have to be so failed and so bankrupt and so corrupt and so ineffective that finally someone wakes up and says there's another way. And I really think this is what propelled the United States over the past two resets. That the United States in the 1860s and 70s, after a vicious civil war, and then in the 1930s, somehow had enough new people, enough new immigrants, that while every other country was stuck, it could reset. My father used to tell me a story, Nadine, about World War II. And he said that when any other country the U.S. was fighting, there would be a battle and a leader would be killed. Almost the whole platoon would be disabled. But he said there was something in the mixture of the American platoon, black, white, Italian, Jewish, that any leader could emerge quickly. My dad was a simple man. That ability to reset by tapping individual capability. That's I don't get me wrong. The United States has a lot of resources. But London, England, the United States, even Canada, where I now live, all of these countries seem trapped, sclerotic. You look at what's happening in the seats of power, how they support the banks. You know, all the money is going to this frivolous, speculative activity, ignoring human capital. I think the opportunity is there, and that's why I like Zacaria's notion of the rise of the rest. This idea that there are so many pockets of the world that have resources, capability, that if those pockets could harness that, if this strategy can be put in place, if we'd stop building so darn sclerotic and trapped, almost anyone can rise up like a phoenix. And I've been going around the world now for a decade talking about this, encouraging, imploring, because the gains to being a first mover here are unimaginable. So that's where I think you guys have to take advantage of this great reset, take advantage of the sclerosis that has trapped others, and just find a mechanism to unlock this creative capability combined with density and urbanism and begin to show the world how that is done. And you know, the clock of history is always ticking. The clock of history doesn't stop moving. Sooner or later, someone will figure this out. Sooner or later, some enterprising group of people somewhere in the world will say, okay, and they're going to mobilize behind this path and go. And I think the other advantage you have is the young people. I don't like demographic arguments, but the one thing I know is there's something in being young at the moment of change. An older person comes to a change process with a somewhat open mind, but really imprinted with the social and economic DNA of the past. Young people are looking at this world anew. So if you have a large number of young people looking at the world anew, being in a way globally oriented, connected to the world in whatever fashion they are, that's a huge advantage where so much of the West is. So my hunch is by harnessing youthful energy, by giving people the ability to live their dream, to mobilize resources, and by doing the adjustments in institutions you need to do, you have a great chance. But if you don't do it, the thing is, if you don't do it, someone else sooner or later will. And I think it's great that you're leading this effort, that the discussion and conversation is starting. And I don't encourage you to try to move as quickly, everyone, move as quickly as possible to define the frontier of this new growth and urban strategy.
Thank you very much, Richard. This has been a treat. I've enjoyed it enormously. Ladies and gentlemen, shall we give Richard Florida?
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine.
Richard, we've got here a number of young students, especially here to listen to you. I hope they will take this phenomenally wonderful lecture that you've given us to heart and generate their own new ideas. You're absolutely right. It's time to be creative in every way, even in the way we organize ourselves and our government. And this is what the new growth strategy is all about. And Richard, we invited you once before to come to Pakistan. I remember talking to your wife about it, Umair talked to you about it. I hope you will come to Pakistan at some stage, come and see us yourself and allow us to, sit and talk to you in person. To be first movers, but this is a question of changing the hearts and minds of 200 million people. That's why we are talking to everybody. That's why we are trying to motivate the youth to move on. So thank you very much, Richard. Thank you. We've put all your ideas in practice. We are working with your ideas. I'm also in touch with Robert Lucas and Gary Becker, etc., at Chicago to help us move forward, trying to put the best brain power I can into this country, our growth strategy to move forward. And come to Pakistan. See you on Twitter, Richard. Thank you very much.
We will. Thank you.